Forget the birds and the bees. Making babies in 2018 is as much about dry ice and expedited delivery.
We have magazines and we have a screen with movies, then they can just make themselves comfortable.
So the essentials there.
Yeah.
Lab technician Martin is giving me a tour around the world's biggest sperm bank, Cryos International in Aarhus, Denmark.
Log in to our system.
He's just shown me the donor cabin. Here's what happens once that sperm sample is collected.
Then we freeze it. We are slowly lowering the straws into liquid nitrogen.
The samples could stay in there for weeks, for months, for years.
Yeah, forever.
It looks like a big tank. You pull out a straw. They look like plastic drinking straws, to put it crudely. And how many samples do you think are in here?
Maybe like 40,000 in this one.
I'm Krupa Badi, and for part one of The Changing Face of Procreation on the BBC World Service, I'm exploring the world of assisted reproductive technology. Cryos all began, so the story goes, in 1981 with a dream about sperm. In it, the then 27-year-old founder of the Cryos sperm bank, Ole Schuh, saw hundreds of frozen sperm trapped in the waves of the sea. From then on, he was obsessed. From scouring the university library for books on fertility to experimenting with his own sperm, which he kept in his kitchen freezer. From these humble beginnings, Cryos is a major player in today's $20 billion global fertility industry, shipping small packages of frozen sperm from more than 1,000 donors to women all over the world to use in their IVF or artificial insemination procedures. 65,000 Cryos babies have been born so far worldwide. On the website, you can browse for donors with specific traits: blue eyes, brown hair, black or white, highly educated or sporty. So these look like treasure chests. What's going on here?
These are the boxes we ship to the customers.
You'd put the tank inside and off it goes to its destination, which could be just
all the world.
So how do you feel when you pack off one of these boxes to the relevant clinic?
I feel good because hopefully the customer will be happier and hopefully they will get a child.
Anyone with enough money, be they female, male, gay, straight, single or in a relationship, now has the opportunity to try for a baby of their own. By the end of the century, an estimated 157 million people alive, or 1.4% of the world's population, will owe their lives to assisted reproductive technologies like IVF, donor eggs and sperm and surrogacy. So how are people around the world using these innovations? And how well is society doing in getting to grips with the ethical questions that go hand in hand with the creation of life in these ways? Louise Brown was born on the 25th of July 1978 by caesarean section at Oldham General Hospital in England.
This is a girl, as was expected.
Of all the revolutionary things to happen to procreation since cells started to divide over 2 billion years ago, IVF, or in vitro fertilization, has been the biggest. The men behind the world's first test tube baby were Patrick Steptoe and Robert Edwards. Their work was met for many years with cynicism, and the duo largely relied on private funding to carry out their research.
Test tube fertilization is primarily intended for women who can't have babies because they have blockages in their fallopian tubes. Dr. Steptoe extracts one of their eggs when it's exactly ready to leave the ovary. The egg is then put into a laboratory dish and the husband's sperm are put with it. When fertilization and the first development has taken place, the fertilized egg is placed back in the mother's womb in the position it would normally reach.
This is Robert Edwards the day after the birth.
I think we are both delighted for Mr. and Mrs. Brown, and I would say from all my experience as a scientist, knowing the world of science in this area, that we are likely, very likely indeed, to make this a most successful operation and get many more babies by this technique. And indeed, we'll be able to help other types of infertility.
He was right. Within a few years, IVF babies were delivered in Australia, the USA, Sweden and France. Denmark saw its first IVF baby in 1983.
I have been working in assisted reproduction for the last 35 years. I was part of the team that introduced IVF to Denmark.
Klaus Erding Andersen is a professor in human reproductive physiology at the University of Copenhagen. He's been one of the many doctors who have developed and refined the technique.
The way we do it today is that we say, okay, the more eggs we have, the better the chance that you become pregnant. So instead of just having one egg, as she normally produces every menstrual cycle, we actually supply her with some hormones that make sure that she makes more than one egg. Often it's around 10 eggs. And then just an hour before that they would ovulate and be released to become fertilized, and we take them out from the ovary and put them into a dish, and then we add the sperm cells.
In the mid-90s, this technology was further improved with the invention of intracytoplasmic sperm injections, known as ICSI. It gave men with weak sperm that can't penetrate the egg wall the chance to become fathers. You can watch videos of it on YouTube, the exact moment of conception caught on camera as the sperm cell is sucked into a tiny syringe and then injected directly into the egg.
When we started out, every time we had a pregnant woman, no matter how many we have treated, was an absolute victory. And now it depends on the age of the woman, but it's fair to say that for every couple which starts an IVF cycle, 1/3 will have a child, on average.
IVF success rates differ between countries and so do costs, from around $2,000 to $3,000 per cycle in Eastern Europe to $12,000 to $15,000 in the US. But it's a price prospective parents are willing to pay because the result is... That's the sound of 3-month-old baby Saskia gurgling away in her flouncy pink dress. It's a happy home in the south of England, with Mum Lucy and Dad Tom trying to keep on top of the usual chaos of 3 boys under 7, a newborn, and a coop full of chickens. But looking at family photos, Saskia's arrival into the clan has been rather unusual.
So here's Saskia as a 6-year-old embryo. So Saskia was conceived in 2014 and then frozen. And this is a picture of her when she was thawed last year, just before the transfer.
These days, the idea of having a baby that has spent some time on ice is not as extraordinary as it once might have been. Many couples create a batch of embryos during a course of IVF and then freeze them. They then implant them 1 or 2 at a time until they feel their family is complete. It's hard to know exactly how many frozen embryos are in storage today, but we're talking hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million in the United States alone. Families have to choose what to do with the unwanted ones, pay for them to stay in frozen storage for decades, dispose of them, or donate them to medical research or to couples who cannot create their own embryos. She is adorable. Look at those cheeks! With those big brown eyes, and what a head of hair. If you're of Indian heritage, you are guaranteed to be born with a good head of hair. You heard right. Saskia is of Indian heritage. Put simply, she is brown and the rest of her family is white. She was one of these leftover embryos conceived through IVF by an Indian-American couple in the US. Lucy and Tom had originally been told they could not have children and had looked into different forms of adoption before Lucy fell pregnant naturally with their first son. 2 more boys later, when it came to baby number 4, they still felt the pull of adoption. So they put themselves forward for an embryo adoption program called Snowflakes, run by a Christian charity in the US called Nightlight. Instead of simply donating unwanted embryos anonymously to other couples, the unusual program allows the genetic parents to have a say in who gives their embryos a shot at life.
We felt really uncomfortable by putting too narrow boundaries on the type of child we'd be willing to adopt. And because the Snowflake program is an open adoption program, the fact that the genetic families have a say in who the adopting family is, I feel like that was a really helpful way of building that sort of relationship.
So we knew it was a possibility that our child might not be the same heritage as us, but that was something we were comfortable with if they chose us for that.
There's regular contact between Saskia's genetic parents and Lucy and Tom.
We've got an email here that we sent after Saskia was born, just saying how excited we were and very thankful to God to say that our baby girl Saskia Naya Grace was born today, weighing 8 pounds 4 ounces, and we'll send pictures through shortly. And we just wanted to let the genetic family know that she was here safely.
So Saskia was born at midnight, but the genetic family were one of the first people we told. We thought that that was important for them to be amongst the first people to know she'd arrived, and we continue to update them every few months now with emails about how she's doing, what she enjoys, how she's growing, and photos to go along with that.
And tell us about what responsibility you feel towards Saskia's Indian heritage and exposing her to it.
Well, I think with all our children, we want to expose them to different cultures to help them understand the world they live in. And so in that regard, I think we'll want to do this same for Saskia as we do with our boys. If she takes a particular interest in her Indian heritage, then we will want to encourage her to explore that, and we hope to be able to inform and educate her about that as best as we can.
When you're out as a family, how do people react to you as a family?
I'm not sure. I think sometimes you see maybe expressions in people's faces, them questioning, that looks a bit different. I think going through the process, we prepared ourselves for that reality. Once people understand that she's adopted, I think they're very quick to accept that.
We have a friend of a friend whose child is born via donor embryo, and so there are other families out there who are built in ways like this too.
And do you believe you will see more families like your family in the future?
Yeah, I think probably there will be, but I think there are a lot of families now who are already built with genetics not being the foundation of it, with blended families through remarriages and things.
And adoption.
And adoption in the traditional way. Families are built differently and aren't about DNA anymore.
Leaving Lucy and Tom's loving family home, I wonder how Saskia's genetic parents feel seeing her photos, and how in the future she will feel about them, her arrival into this world, and her Indian heritage. And what becomes apparent is that in solving one ethical problem, embryo adoption has opened up the potential for many more. I'm Krupa Bhatti, and you're listening to The Changing Face of Procreation on the BBC World Service. In the days after Louise Brown, the so-called test tube baby, was born, fears about doctors playing God to create Frankenstein babies were aired on the BBC.
It's reported there are other similar pregnancies in progress, but many doctors feel very cautious, and there's no question of manufacturing human life.
People from around the world sent Louise Brown's parents death threats, letters covered with red ink made to look like blood, even a broken glass test tube. From its founding roots with the first test tube experiments in the 1960s, through to the unease surrounding stem cell research in the 1990s, the technology has always tested the comfort zones of society.
My name is Anna Smaidor, and I'm an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oslo. I think one of the things that's been difficult about IVF is that the scientific breakthrough that was suddenly announced with the birth of Louise Brown had not really been foreseen by many people. It hadn't been discussed by society. And so it was a shock. And certainly in the UK, there was no legislation governing this at all. Initially, the idea was, some people, sadly, are infertile and some aren't. And IVF is for the infertile ones. But it became very quickly apparent that that is not really exactly how IVF works, because it doesn't cure people's infertility. And it became apparent that many people who wanted to use IVF were being restricted from accessing it on the grounds that they didn't have a proper medical claim to do that. I think there's been a bit of a general failure to address this very central question, which is kind of a simple question: what is it that IVF treats?
IVF has progressed at different speeds in different countries. It's trying to find its place in diverse cultures, religions and legal systems. No one is quite sure where it slots in. In many countries, only heterosexual couples can access IVF. Brazil has recently passed a law that allows daughters and nieces to carry babies for their older relatives, but still only family members are allowed to be surrogates. In Denmark, all women can access tax-funded IVF as long as they're under 40. If they're more than 45, even private IVF is against the law. In places like America, anyone can pay for donors, surrogacy and IVF. India's largely unregulated and cheap fertility industry, together with advanced private medical facilities, make it a hotspot for fertility tourism and a world leader in making mothers out of older women. Last year, a 73-year-old woman and her 80-year-old husband in the Punjab made the headlines after they conceived their son using IVF and a donor egg. The couple had struggled for 46 years to conceive, but for most of their lives couldn't afford fertility treatment. So how old is too old to have a baby using IVF? It's a question I posed to Dr Supriya Puranik, a fertility expert in India.
I've not yet decided, because in India there is no law up till now what should be the upper limit.
Almost 15% of Dr Puranik's patients are aged between 40 and 55, due, she says, to a tendency for Indian couples to try Ayurvedic and other alternative medicines before turning to IVF later in life. Earlier this year, Dr Puranik carried out one of the world's most extraordinary IVF uses so far, twins born to a surrogate using the sperm of a dead man called Prathamesh.
I made a photo wall of him. I kept his things in his room, but I wanted a living memory of him. I'd walk around with his picture, I'd feed the photo, put the photo to sleep. The photo was my Prathamesh. I was psychologically stable, but I couldn't live without him. After his death, I needed a reason to live.
That's Prathamesh's mother, Rajeshri Patil, who came up with the idea to use her dead son's sperm to create her grandchildren. Prathamesh was a student in Germany when he was diagnosed with stage 4 brain cancer. He died in September 2016. Mrs. Patil remembered that Prathamesh had had his sperm sample frozen before his chemotherapy treatment began, just in case he wanted to start a family in the future. And so she thought,
let's use IVF to bring Prathamesh back. They're his cells. This would be him.
Mrs. Patil, 49 at the time, then went to meet Dr Puranik.
She said to me that, Doctor, I have a soul. I have his soul with me. We just needed a body to get him back. My God. So these words gave me literally goosebumps all over.
And from that day onwards, Dr Puranik was determined to make Mrs. Patil's wish come true. She found an egg donor and Mrs. Patil asked her son's 38-year-old auntie to take on the pregnancy.
And finally, the sperms arrived. When they arrived, we were too nervous to even open it up. What could be the condition of those sperms? Because everything was based on emotion.
The pregnancy resulted in twins, a little boy and girl.
They're still young, but when they grow up, they will call me Mama. I didn't want grandchildren. I wanted my son back. I only see him in them.
India is no stranger to the idea of assisted conception. Hindu mythology is full of miraculous births. So for some like Rajeshri Patil and her family, friends and neighbours who celebrated the arrival of the twins, the idea of science giving God a helping hand was nothing out of the ordinary.
This is a miracle. God has given Prathamesh back, and I'm indebted to IVF and Dr Puranik. There's science, and then there's my faith in God.
What's happening in India may be controversial, but these ethical questions are still only relevant to a tiny proportion of people, those who can afford the thousands of dollars required to pay for treatment, or those living in rich countries where IVF and other technologies are free. Despite 1 in 6 couples worldwide experiencing some form of infertility at least once during their reproductive lifetime, these technologies are still out of reach for many. This is what's driving much of today's fertility research. Fernando Zegues Hochschild is one of Latin America's IVF pioneers and a long-time member of the World Health Organization, or WHO.
IVF was always thought by WHO as a first world issue. And in fact, who needed most were people in Africa, who had 32% of secondary infertility due to tubal diseases. Women that are infertile, they have recognized that in many realities, infertile women are second-class citizens. They are rejected from their families. They can't even be buried in family lands because they will contaminate. They can't participate in the burying of their parents. I mean, this is a very serious issue, generating violence, especially in rural areas.
In 2009, thanks in part to Professor Zegers Hochschild, the World Health Organization reclassified infertility from a consequence of diseases such as tubal blockages to a disease in itself.
And by doing that, they have influenced countries. And I think this has been a major change.
He's been keeping track of who gets access to treatment through the World Registry of IVF, which he started with other experts back in 1990. He finds that of the 1.6 million IVF cycles around the world, Latin America makes up just 5%, Europe 47%, and Asia 30%, largely driven by Japan, where there are more than 300,000 cycles per year. What becomes clear is that Europe is driving IVF demand, and South America, together with sub-Saharan Africa, lingers at the other end of the scale.
To have affordability, you don't only lower the costs, but you need to reach the people who need it. And the people who need it are far away many times. They cannot leave their houses. They take care of their aunts and their grandparents. They have chicken to take care of. And many things that will be stolen or not taken care if they leave.
Affordability is a complex issue, but the solution, according to Professor Zegers Hochschild, isn't. Together with colleagues at the University of Edinburgh and Cape Town, he's working on a solution, portable IVF. It could be applicable everywhere, from the highlands of Scotland to the jungles of Africa.
If you live very north in Edinburgh, you live in the highlands, and you want to become pregnant, you have to travel all the way down to Edinburgh. And you have to leave all your things there. And for how long and all that? Why can't we go there? Why can't we go with a car that have all the facilities and do the IVF in the highlands rather than in Edinburgh? And the same is true for Africa, and the same is true for Chile and for any country.
This is where we prepare the... Where is it? You just come in, that's all right.
Back in Denmark, Professor Claus Erding Andersen from the University of Copenhagen is busy conjuring up his own alternative solution to bring down the costs of IVF. For him, it's all about the eggs. Today, women are given large doses of very powerful drugs so that they produce multiple eggs during their menstrual cycle. The drugs also control when those eggs are released.
We are now starting to go backwards in that chain of development of the egg. So we can now start to use eggs at an earlier stage. We now slowly start to understand how does this all happen in the ovary. And if we go one step back, and we can still get oocytes. So this is, I think we will actually see, perhaps in the next 10 years, that we will be able to treat the egg in that dish and not the woman. So we will not need to put all the hormones in the body to affect those small eggs in the ovary, but we can take out the eggs and then affect them in the petri dish. And there we don't need hardly any hormone. So maybe this is one of the things which is a development which will make this a lot more affordable, so a lot more people can use it.
4 decades and 8 million births after the first IVF baby was born, reproductive technology is firmly embedded in our lives. Thanks to research into IVF, we now have genetic screening for some serious diseases, stem cell technology, and all sorts of new kinds of families. It's an exciting time for scientists, but an unsettling one for society trying to play catch-up on important ethical debates.
On the one hand, you have stories of miracle babies and happy, wholesome-looking parents. And on the other side, sort of dark dystopian possibilities. And there's always a lot of excitement every time there's a new breakthrough. But reproduction, I think, is such a visceral thing for human beings that we both celebrate it and we kind of fear what could become of it, what could become of us. It goes right to the heart of our identities.
In part 2 of The Changing Face of Procreation, we'll introduce you to the clinical innovations that will define fertility technology in decades to come.
Most babies born to people with good health care around the world will actually be conceived in a lab and not in a bed. Parents will do that for the most part in order to have healthier children, but the process will allow them to also make other choices about cosmetics or behavioral traits or boy or girl.
And we'll take a peek at the societies of the future.
There are children books about children conceived using donor sperm, so I read those to her and I say like, oh, this is just like you. You were made in mommy's tummy with help from someone, and there's also like a donor out there who helped us.
IVF has come a long way in 40 years, but there's much more to come.
Thanks for listening. We'll have more for you soon, and please do subscribe. The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from. Why not try Crowd Science, where we take your questions about life, Earth and the universe to researchers hunting for answers at the frontiers of knowledge.
My task is to remember this unrelated list of words by placing each word at a point along my journey.
Try to find a kind of similarity between my word and your location. Like a bit of it's of the same group, it's of the same material. Somehow it is similar. The idea is afterwards, if you go through your 20 locations again, that the location itself, some kind of aspect of it, some kind of property of it, will remind you of the word that you memorized because it has a close connection.
And to listen to Crowd Science, just search for it wherever you access your podcasts.
It's 40 years since in vitro fertilisation, or IVF, revolutionised the way humans procreate. British-born Louise Brown was the world's first test tube baby. Her birth astonished societies around the world. It challenged our deeply ingrained notions of kinship, parenthood and human reproduction. But it also opened the doors to couples who would otherwise have remained childless.
When we started out, every time we had a pregnant woman, no matter how many we have treated, was an absolute victory.
In part 1, we met the new types of families created by artificial reproductive technology, twins born using frozen sperm from a dead man.
Let's use IVF to bring Prathamesh back. They're his cells. This would be him.
The embryos left on ice only to be born years later.
So Saskia was conceived in 2014 and then frozen. And this is a picture of her when she was thawed last year, just before the transfer.
I'm Krupa Bhatti, and in part 2 of The Changing Face of Procreation on the BBC World Service, I'm looking at what's next for the assisted reproductive technology sector. Infertility isn't solely a rich world's problem, so how can we spread the benefits of IVF? What clinical innovations can we expect next? And what will happen to social structures once age and relationship status are no longer barriers to parenthood? It's dinner time at Pia Krona Christensen's house, and bubbling on the slow cooker is spaghetti bolognese. Her 2-year-old daughter, Sarah, plays with her friends in the lounge, switching her attention between kids' TV and a giant space hopper. It's all very normal. But in fact, this gathering is part of a growing subculture of family life, a product of assisted reproductive technology and IVF, and perhaps a sign of things to come.
I've always wanted children, and even like being in a relationship, like in my early 20s, I remember talking about having children with my partner at the time was an issue. And it was more like, yeah, it'll come. And then like the relationship ended. With the next one, like he wanted to travel a lot before he had children. And then the relationship ended. And at the time, I was gonna go and pursue my PhD outside of Denmark. And I was very much struggling with the implications of having a child with a man in a different country I would either have to settle in that country forever or, there would be some issues.
For many single women around the world in their 30s and 40s, this story will sound very familiar. Pia was nearing the end of her fertile years and hadn't found a suitable partner to have children with. At 39, after studying in Canada to become a neuroscientist, she returned to Denmark and immediately started IVF with donor sperm.
I was lucky to become pregnant in the first round of IVF with Sarah, so that was amazing. And I just remember giving birth to her, and I was at the hospital, and I was just so grateful, and I didn't know where to turn my gratefulness to, but I just I just sat in the chapel of the hospital just crying, because it's not that I'm super religious or anything, but I just needed to be grateful somewhere. And
Pia had joined a growing number of women in Denmark called solo mums. In 2007, the Danish government made IVF free for all Danish women under 40, regardless of their sexuality or relationship status. And not having a dad is just one of the ways this kind of policy move is changing the family unit. Do you worry about Sarah not having siblings?
I do, and I very much wanted one. And I had, with the IVF treatment, I had 7 eggs taken out and 3 become fertilized. And 1 became Sarah, and this other one went in the freezer. The third one didn't divide. So I think, 4 months ago, I tried with the last egg, but unfortunately it didn't succeed. So, yeah.
Sarah didn't get to have a sibling, but she does have several dibblings, half-brothers or sisters born using the same donor sperm. Pia managed to find some of them through a Facebook group.
So I wrote Sarah's donor number and ID, and I said, if anybody is interested, and there weren't anyone on the list at the time, but then suddenly it just came trickling in, and now we found 5 others. 1 girl in Germany, a boy in Norway, and another boy in Denmark, and another girl in Sweden, and another boy in Sweden. So we're now 5.
The families have been getting to know each other through regular contact and even weekends away together.
We don't know how our children is going to react later on. They might really want to seek identity in someone, or might want to meet someone that looks like them, or has the same experience, or have something in common, especially now where I'm not going to have more siblings for Sarah. Then I want to lay the ground, and I want to lay the opportunity that she can use this and seek whatever she wants out of this relationship. So she feels that these children will be her siblings, and they feel like that at the time. They have my full support, but if they just want to say, hi, I'm out there, and have a Facebook group where they just talk randomly from time to time, I'll totally support that too.
It's easy to see where this casual approach to the family unit comes from. Researchers have found there are 37 different types of family in Denmark, ranging from solo mums to lesbian couples. It's Scandi-liberalism in its element. And the number of women in Denmark using reproductive technology to have children on their own seems to be rising. According to figures from a leading clinic for single women in Copenhagen, between 2016 and 2017, the number of single Danish women they treated doubled from 100 to 200. Even more interestingly, the age profile dropped from an average of 35 to an average of 33. As the phenomenon grows, so does the backlash.
I think for 6 months, on a weekly basis, there was an answer to my article in any kind of media, newspapers, radio.
Meet Rasmus Ulstrup Larsen, who says last year he was the most hated man in Copenhagen. He's become the unlikely figurehead of a section of Danish society deeply unsettled by the changes afoot. Just 28 and a high school economics teacher, Last year, he gained fame, or notoriety, depending on your outlook, with a newspaper article that called solo mums
a horrible modern phenomena. And I think that was what really triggered everything. And I argued that because we allow single moms to get impregnated alone, we've now opened the gate for the fact that people don't have to be something for other people than themselves, and they can still realize what is our most important and common goal, which is to get children.
Jeg er ikke ude på, at den enkelte menneske ikke giver mening, at man skal det, så det kan jeg sagtens
Men du kan jo så
Det er summen af de enkelte mennesker.
Rasmus and Pia had it out on national TV.
Jamen, jeg kommer enormt meget andre mennesker ved. Jeg har jo et kæmpe netværk.
And Rasmus was inundated with hundreds of comments on his Facebook page. Some had a distinctly misogynistic tone, accusing women like Pia of selfishness and promiscuity. But it wasn't just angry men that found some truth in this message. Traditional Danes from outside Copenhagen also lent him their support.
In Copenhagen, there are more women than there are men, etc. Men tend to stay in the outer rims of Denmark, and they can't find a suitable partner here in Copenhagen. But that's not to say there aren't any men who wish to have children or get married. There just aren't the right men for these women, and that's a big difference. Men are doing worse than girls in the lower classes. They're doing worse than women at the universities, and more women are getting ahead of these men. So there's a discrepancy with what women want in a partner and how many men there are with these attributes that women want. And I think that's a reason why women feel there aren't any men.
But what's the solution? Women not being as educated, women not choosing to be solo mums? What are the options? What options do women have?
I think the major solution is a cultural change of mind in what the purpose of life is. If you're having difficulties finding a partner to get children, not because nobody wants you, but because there are nobody you want to have, then you can lower your demands or you can take the consequence.
You seem to have been almost adopted by some men as their spokesman. Would you say that you are speaking for men on this issue?
No, my perspective is not a battle of gender. I think a lot of men are extremely happy that a man dares to take up these issues because you do get a lot of hate.
So what did Pia make of Rasmus's suggestion that women should lower their demands of a partner?
I think that the problem here is not necessarily that women don't want the men, but the men don't want to commit to having children with women.
She says she is open to starting a new relationship with a man, although she wouldn't expect him to become a father to her daughter. But she rejects the idea that the children of the future may miss having a dad.
The fact about the family being the mom, dad and children and participating fathers is very new. We don't have to go very far back. My family or my great-grandparents, I don't think the father was necessarily very much involved in upbringing the children. It was a family, but this thing about dads being absent now and solo moms, I don't really see the big emotional issue about that.
Pia comes across as bright, fiercely independent and emotionally strong. Her journey to motherhood seems typical of the way IVF and sperm donation are changing Denmark's family setup. But Anna Smidor, an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Oslo, offers some food for thought about these new paths.
There's a general social trend across the globe that where women have access to education, to economic independence and to political and social rights, the fertility rate goes down, the age that women first become mothers goes up. And this is happening everywhere where the middle classes are growing, where women's rights are being recognised. And I think we really have to ask ourselves as societies whether this constitutes a problem or whether we should regard it as being a great thing that technology gives us the possibility to say to women, hey, you don't have to sacrifice your career or your education by becoming a mother at 25. You can freeze your eggs and become a mother at 50 if that's how things work better in the environment that we expect women to live in in modern democracies. So I think this is going to be a really important issue. As we see that technology facilitates all these new choices for women, we have to ask ourselves whether we want to celebrate and really maximise our use of these new techniques that we have.
I'm Krupa Padhi and you're listening to The Changing Face of Procreation on the BBC World Service. As well as changing the families of the future, fertility research is going to have far-reaching consequences for other areas of people's lives, especially those living with cancer.
So here we have all the boxes where the ovarian tissue is kept when it's stored.
Back in Copenhagen, Denmark, fertility doctor Claus Erding Andersen is showing me his tanks full of frozen ovaries.
Contains liquid nitrogen, which is minus 200 degrees, and we can keep them here for as long as we want. We have now frozen ovaries here in Denmark for more than 1,100 patients. We actually always keep them in two separate. So half of it is here, and the other half is in another room. If we have a fire or an accident, because this is, of course, the woman's only chance of keeping her fertility. So if an accident should happen...
I interviewed Professor Andersen in the morning. That afternoon, his team would freeze sections of a Swedish woman's ovary to be re-implanted back into her after her chemotherapy treatment.
So you can see we have all the equipment and all the scalpels and equipment that we need to prepare an ovary for cryopreservation. So we are waiting for this to come around in any time now. So it takes 6 months from when you put back the tissue until she's actually up and running again and is fertile.
Ovarian transplants can even be done in babies.
The youngest one we have done is just half a year, and of course her tissue will need to stand cryopreserved for, say, 25 years. And then we can sort it out, and then we actually know now that it'll start to work and provide fertility to her. And I think that there's now around 18 Danish kids being born from having frozen salt ovarian tissue transplanted. So there is a lot of women who actually benefit from this, and we have also just Danish young girls who may be 26 coming back to us and saying, I'm menopausal, I actually don't have a partner, but I just don't want to be in a menopausal. Can you put back on my tissue so I'm just a normal young girl? And she can have that.
That must make you, as a doctor, feel hugely satisfied.
We often don't talk to the patients because they would be situated somewhere else, but they do express that this is of huge importance to them. And if you were a young girl, and now, I mean, more than 80% of cancer, people with cancer, they survive. They are long-term survivors. And of course, they want to survive, but the very first thing that these young patients say afterwards is, can you save my fertility? So it is of a huge importance to them. And I'm usually just saying, very humble, that we are here for the patient's sake. And if they want what we're doing, then this is what we should try and achieve.
The team is also pioneering a technique that could change the lives of millions of women worldwide.
The interesting thing is that the egg is embedded in a follicle. That follicle also contains other types of cells. These cells produce all the sex hormones of a woman. So this is basically what is regulating the menstrual cycle. And these sex hormones have a tremendous amount of different functions around the body. For instance, they strengthen your bones, they secure against cardiovascular disease, they secure against cognitive decline. And when a woman then enters menopause, this is basically because her ovaries run out of eggs. There's no more eggs in there.
Thanks to the knowledge gained through IVF research, menopause, as well as involuntary childlessness, could become a thing of the past.
So an option has now arisen that if you take out some ovarian tissue when you are young and freeze it, you can actually put it back when you enter menopause, and then you will postpone menopause. You will have your own HRT factory, hormone replacement therapy. You don't need to take pills to secure that you have these hormones. You basically have the structure in your body, which is from nature's side designed to produce exactly these hormones.
The idea that menopause needs to be medically managed is controversial. But for those who do want help, this technique could be a breakthrough. But as a side consequence of this, it also means that women would be able to have children way into their 50s when they would normally be going through the menopause.
No, that's absolutely correct. You have to openly acknowledge that the egg goes with that follicle. The interesting thing is that you can transplant the ovarian tissue anywhere you like, which means that you can position it somewhere where even when the egg is released, it will not be picked up by the oviduct. So in that sense, you can secure that you will just have the hormones released to the bloodstream, but the egg will not reach the point where it needs to go into the uterus. So you will not make old mothers. But if the woman says, oh, put back my tissue, and then goes to a fertility clinic and they say, oh, so you want to have kids when you are 50 or 60, you cannot avoid it.
Assisted reproductive technology, or ART, is extending parenthood to anyone who can't just have sex and make a baby for themselves. But let's take a leap into the future. What if we reach a point where ART becomes the norm? Listen to this astounding prediction from Professor Hank Greeley, director of the Stanford Center for Law and the Biosciences. He believes that in the next 20 to 40 years,
most babies born to people with good health care around the world will actually be conceived in a lab and not in a bed.
having sex to make babies could become a thing of the past.
Parents will do that for the most part in order to have healthier children, but the process will allow them to also make other choices about cosmetics or behavioral traits or boy or girl.
His predictions are driven by the rise of PGD, or pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, a technique that involves a few cells being removed from embryos when they are 3 to 5 days old for genetic testing. The parents and doctors then decide which embryos to try to turn into babies.
When I talk about PGD, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, to most people, they think it's still science fiction, but it's actually 28 years old. And it's used every year in tens of thousands of cases all over the world. Right now, we can't test for that many genetic traits at a time. We're only looking at 3 or 4 or 5 different genetic traits.
Diseases like Down syndrome, hepatitis B and HIV are currently screened for during a pregnancy. But as our understanding of the human genome develops, more and more genetic information will be available to parents. But only those undergoing IVF will have access to these details.
Because in order to take cells from an embryo, you have to know where the embryo is. You have to be able to grab the embryo. And if you conceive the old-fashioned way, at 3 to 5 days, that embryo is halfway down one of the woman's 2 fallopian tubes. Good luck finding it. So PGD is only possible with and because of IVF. But IVF is a expensive, difficult, unpleasant procedure, and so that limits the rate at which PGD is currently being used.
But a new technique currently being tested in mice, where eggs and sperm are made from skin cells, could change that.
I foresee a future where a couple wanting to have a baby will go to a clinic. He will probably give a sperm sample the old-fashioned way. She will not undergo an egg harvest. She'll give a skin cell sample. Those skin cells will be turned into induced pluripotent stem cells, which will be turned into eggs. One of the advantages of this over egg harvest, not only is it cheaper, easier, less risky, but with egg harvest, how many eggs do you get? Somewhere between 0 and 25. If you're making them from skin cells, how many eggs do you get? How many do you want? Tens, hundreds, thousands, millions, potentially. I expect to see couples make about 100 embryos, have each one of them tested. The lab will then ask the couple, what do you want to know about these embryos? Do you want to know about just serious diseases near term? Do you want to know long-term disease risks? Do you want to know cosmetic traits? Do you want to know boy or girl? Do you want to know behavioral traits? The parents will get that information and then try to decide among the 100 which ones they want to try to turn into babies.
If you thought the moral considerations we're grappling with around fertility treatment in 2018 are complicated, think what the possibility of choosing between 100 fully profiled embryos would mean. Parents could be disappointed if their offspring don't turn out the way they'd hoped. Imagine this conversation between mother and daughter.
Not only do I want you to be a doctor, I picked you out of 100 embryos because your genes said you were going to be a doctor, and now you tell me you want to be a journalist?
Rich people's children would get biological advantages over other children. And many disabilities could be effectively removed from the human gene pool.
In some ways, the hardest are questions where parents may want a child who the rest of the world thinks is disabled. The best example of that is probably in the deaf community, where there are deaf parents who do not think that deafness is a disability. They think it's another way of being, and they would like to have a deaf child. Now, if we had two parents who had a child with normal hearing, and they decided to deafen that child by sticking needles in its ears or doing something else barbaric, we'd have no trouble throwing them in jail and taking the kid away from them. Should we let deaf parents choose a deaf embryo over a hearing embryo? I think that's a tough question.
Klaus Erding Andersen in Denmark sees dark possibilities ahead.
I think for me, the worst case scenario is that if you, for instance, is in America, you have 10 eggs aspirated, and then you come back to the doctor and he says, so which one would you like us to transplant? And the answer from the couple would be, oh, but now you have checked them genetically, doctor, we are very happy with that. Would you please select the embryo with the lowest health insurance?
Wow.
And this is a potential scenario. I think that we should be very cautious. My point is that we, as a professional scientist and doctors, we are not the ones who are going to decide this. Everybody can understand these scenarios. How do we want this to develop in our society? This is a much bigger question which everybody who's interested in society should basically have a chance to have a say in.
Anna Smydor too cautions against being overly optimistic about the potential consequences of fertility treatments.
One of the things I think we need to be careful of is the language of biological necessity, and especially when that is associated with the idea that every woman has to be a mother at all costs. I certainly don't want to deny the fact that many women do want to become mothers at all costs, but I think what we have to be really careful about in society and in our medical practices is that we don't socially inculcate this belief that they're a sort of failure in terms of womanhood and their existence if they haven't had a child. So I think we need to think carefully about the idea of biological compulsion and social compulsion moving together to force people into ever more complicated ways of producing babies.
Most human beings desire a biological family, and 40 years ago there was only one way to do that: a man's sperm meeting a woman's egg inside her body. Today, the miracle of life is engineered in a lab. From the birth of Louise Brown, the world's first test tube baby, to a future where we will alter human genetic code in a dish and stop having sex to procreate, artificial reproductive technology is taking us places that many thought unimaginable. In another 40 years, the technology will inevitably become cheaper, more advanced and simpler. We could see a time in the not-so-distant future when, for all but the very poorest, anyone who wants a baby, regardless of their sexuality or relationship status, will get a baby. That's the easy bit. The tougher part is the increasingly complex and divisive moral maze that we, as society, have to wade through. And that challenge is just beginning.
Thank you for listening. There will be more from the documentary podcast soon. The documentary is just one of our BBC World Service podcasts. There are many others to choose from. Why not try People Fixing the World, with brilliant solutions to the world's problems?
We're going to look at two ideas that involve changing the day-to-day lives of children at school. I will be looking at a project that involves children doing this kind of thing. It's a solution being put into practice at a primary school in the north of England. But there's a connection to communist-era Hungary.
And to listen to People Fixing the World, just search for it wherever you access your podcasts.